Cool. Okay, right. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Let's go straight to the point. 7 minutes are short. We heard quite a lot about COVID and cities, and I think one of the things that we heard a lot is that we are living unprecedented time, but they are not so unprecedented. If we start to look at the 10 years yield of the Standard & Poor 500, you can clearly see those curves of crisis, basically. What started to be clear is that after each crisis, we always built a new typology of cities. So we always use these moments of rethinking, reimagination to redesign our cities. For instance, from the long depression came out the famous Garden City. That was to also get rid of the first wave of the pollution that started to trample our cities. And then, after the war, we had the famous Futurama in 1940s. We had, the modern cities as it was presented in America. And then go on and on until the smart city, which clearly has emerged also thanks to the massive financing that came after the crisis of 2008. So, now we are at the peak of this curve. So we are at the peak again of the 10 years yield of the Standard & Poor. And so what kind of city is coming after that? We don't know, but that is the point. We need to start to think about it. And our approach is to think of a new regenerative city. So, and this is a city that is capable to regenerate space, activities, and values. So these three key elements in cities. The first step, of course, is to change the way we think of change, because after each crisis or after each catastrophic event, we have always thought that, that we couldn't do this anymore. So for instance, after the 9/11 in New York, if you would read the magazines, like nobody would like to live in downtown anymore. Or if you think of Japan after the tsunami, who hell would ever live next to the coastal area anymore? But we always did it. So we always came back to these areas. We always repopulate our cities. And the same after Corona, we're going to be back here and we're going to be strong, even more than before. So the only thing we need to do is that we need to be less reactive to the events and start to build a thriving system that needs to embrace change and build a regenerative system. So another step is to social imagination. And this is something actually at demos we're doing right now. So today and tomorrow we have this Untitled Festival, which is exactly about reimagining the future together. You can check it out if you have time. But for cities, the process is to think of first having this social imagination process where together we think, what is the desired future state we want to achieve? Then we go through experimentations. And then super important that we haven't talked about it enough during this COVID is the retention. So how do we convince our mayors, our policymakers that all the experiments that they've done, all the nice things that have worked during this COVID, they can actually be retained and they can be approved and kept in the city for the future. The third step is to build a new story. And this means to change the current one. So the current story is that the public sector usually is doing the plan. The private sector is building and operating services. And then the people are often participating to the process and consuming the final output. So they are still consumer. It's still consumer society based and it's still part of the industrial narrative. We want to change this narrative, thinking that people are first. And in this regenerative city story, people, they don't participate, but they cooperate. So they actually cooperate and learn from the planning process. So it means that the public is planning and making the vision. We add here the third sector that needs to pool resources, because after COVID, without pooling resources from the first sector, we're not going to go that fast. And then, of course, the private still builds, but it doesn't just operate, but cooperate with people. Cities were telling me all the time when I present these models, okay, how do we make this happen? So we started to create a framework for regenerative cities, also based on the feedback of city officials and experts and deputy mayors that have been listening to our stories. And we come up with these 4 elements that the first one is about transforming governance. So we need to bring people's first at the attention of the policy making process. Transmobility, it's a new idea of bringing together communication technology, with transit technologies. So it's a new way to bring not just places together, but also people, since we're moving to an era of not hypermobility, but actually immobility. So we need to understand how to deal with less movement. And retrofit in the urban environment, because clearly right now it's not regenerative. The buildings are, even the most sustainable building, it's still sustainable, but it still produces some CO2. So we are not happy anymore with carbon neutral. We want to go beyond that. We want to have buildings that actually are heating cities. And then when it's about data, we need to treat it as a common. So we need to treat it as something that belongs to everybody. And if companies are using public data, this information has to be shared back to the owners, which actually is the people. So these are kind of the first steps. Well, time flies. I think I have like 30 seconds. So maybe I would just like to say that I think the most important thing is to think, okay, what is the place for urban data in this process? Because I've been working with data for now about 10 years. So it's kind of very interesting now to work at demos, because it's kind of trying to understand how data then can be used in these processes. And the model right now is divided in 3 steps. So when we approach regenerative cities model, is that we start always with the data, because clearly from here we understand the questions and we try to find some correlations in this information. So here we use the sort of artificial intelligence to really understand what are the hidden problems and what are the things that seems to match and mismatch. But we never understand causation from this. I noticed this in many, many years, that data it's mostly raising some questions, especially when it's big data. And so we need engagement. We need to have participation. We need to bring people into the process. We need to show this data. We need to inform. And only when people learn from data, then they are capable to understand, okay, what are the causations? What are the real insight? What the information is actually telling me? And then only after that, we can start the foresight project. So only then we can start to reimagine the city of the future. And that's it. So if you are interested, we have all our reports are public, and we can have, of course, we can continue the conversation later via email or in the next plenary session. Thank you.